What's happening, guys? James from Sigma Strength and Physique. Got a pretty ripping leg session for you today. It is a brutally tough leg session. We're going to cover intensity, but also how to structure your leg session. Just while I've got your attention, just doing my hamstring warm up there. What I'm actually trying to do is just shorten the hamstring, so essentially curl the hamstring up without getting my arse to push back or my hips to tilt or bend at all, which is going to replicate what we're trying to do in the hamstring curl a little bit later. It's just a really good activation that's very applicable to the movement we're going to do. But while I rattle on about structure and intensity, you can just sort of watch me do my single leg hammy warm-ups. But in terms of intensity, you just can't push legs hard enough. I mean, they just need, I cannot stress this enough, they just need to be absolutely flogged. Quads in particular, just really durable muscles. So whenever possible, have a training partner or even just grab a spot to help you get a few extra reps out on, you know, your leg press, your squat, hack squat, whatever you're doing, even your leg extension, hammy curls, it all just sort of adds up. But we'll go through a few options if you don't have a spot or a training partner like I do today. So there'll be a lot of sort of single leg unilateral stuff where we can sort of find ways to be able to push ourselves close to fatigue. We'll go through intensity a little bit later, as you'll see some pretty nasty sets. The other thing to think about are the legs, quads in particular. They respond well to very wide and varying rep ranges. So anywhere from like your 3 to 5 to even up to 100 reps, as you'll see a little bit later. In terms of structure, I love prioritising hammies. I think hammies get neglected. So I generally start my leg sessions with 1 or 2 hamstring movements. I love single leg hammy curls that I'm doing here simply because I don't cheat as much, so I can actually shorten the hamstring, which essentially means getting the hamstring to curl as much as possible without my arse lifting up. As soon as your arse starts to lift up, the load is going elsewhere, probably onto your glute or God knows where, but it's not going to your hammy. So I'm really working hard here to drive my thigh into the pad and really keep my hips pinned down. I think you'll notice next time you jump in and do the hammy curl that you'll have probably a tendency to want to actually lift the bum up, and of course it's going to move on occasions. The other reason this is great is you actually use your other leg to help you up. So when I get stuck, this is my top working set now, I think, I'm actually using my right leg, but getting the left leg just to chime in whenever it needs to. So it really allows me to push past failure. I choose this early on over something like a seated leg curl where you're locked in, just simply because of the stability required here. So while my hammies are relatively fresh, I'll actually do this one. And then maybe like a seated hammy curl later where I'm locked in and don't have to worry about stability. You can just flog the hammies. But early on, stability is going to be a little bit of an issue. So while the hammies are fresh, this is the one I'll do, or you can jump in and do like a Romanian deadlift or something once you're warmed up. But what I've done here on my last set is I've done probably 4 sets of 5 each leg, and then this last set I'm going straight into as many reps as possible on both legs. You'll find with both legs that the hips will have a tendency to want to lift up. You won't be able to shorten the hammies quite as much, but it's okay to cheat a little bit like that. Like we'd rather do an extra few half reps than sort of stop a few reps short. But even just into partials at the end, just trying to get everything we can out of the hammies. Cooking the hammies early on is not going to detract from your squatting, leg press, whatever it is you do. But I do find that if I smash my quads in, say a leg extension or something, that they do tend to take away significantly from my hack squats or my squat that I'm doing, which is where the magic happens for quads. So that ramble essentially means think about prioritising hammies, and when you do that, try and choose the more complex hamstring movements early on when you're freshest, and then sort of move on to your more stable hammy movements like a seated hammy curl, etc. So now moving on to glute ham raise. Now some of you may not have this machine. I think it's just the absolute best hammy movement overall. I'm only going to hang around 3 to 5 reps because that's all I can do. You can do this with your feet under a bar. You can do this with someone holding onto your ankles if you don't have this machine, but I really recommend some variation of this or a Nordic. I think what I'm called is doing a Nordic because there's just no glute involved. So the main thing we're focusing on here is pushing the heels into the plate and making sure that our hips stay really stable. So I'm really sort of extending my lower back just a little bit just to ensure that I don't sort of flop around. It's really sort of important that we don't dip too much. It's just literally coming out and then pushing hard into the plate to come back in and you're really going to feel the hammies activate there. It's pretty intense feeling, but it's a great movement. I think some of the research shows it's pretty good for injury prevention. There's a lot of hammy tears in sport tend to happen when decelerating, and working the hammies through this range tends to strengthen them. So they're a little bit sort of safer from what I understand, but I hate running, so it doesn't bother me. And now moving on to a single leg extension. I'm going to not flog my quads in this because I want to be able to be pretty sort of fresh for my hack squat. But I'll work this probably sort of 3 sets of 10 each leg, probably at about 70-80% intensity, just good quality contractions. Like I'm not trying to fling the weight up. Important thing to note is keeping the hips locked in. So you notice I don't want my hips to rock at all. I find a lot of clients tend to want to rock their hips to initiate the movement, but everything's still locked in stone. I think we've got a seat belt on this one, which helps. But around your sort of 10 to 12 each leg, I'll do 2 or 3 sets of this. And again, if you really want to push this one, you can get the other leg to chime in whenever needed. But I cannot stress enough, again, just focusing on quality contraction, so knees and toes up to the roof. Sorry about the view there. But yeah, really just focusing on getting that quad to shorten at the top, and you'll feel it sort of shoot right up through the top of the quad, up through the rec fem when you're doing it properly. So I think I literally just did two sets of 10 or 12 on this to like 80% intensity, gets my knees warmed up, gets the quads firing, and then we're sort of right to go for where the magic happens, which is going to be your squat. I've moved away from bar squatting. I just think hack squat just suits my profile. Being pretty tall, I find that my back tends to give out, and just having shit leverages for squatting with bars and whatnot. I just get a great range of motion here, so I'm getting quite deep. I'm sort of flexing the knee to a pretty good angle, which is what we want to do with quads. So with quads, we're trying to pick a squat where we can actually essentially lengthen your quad as much as possible, which for all intents and purposes mean bending the knee as much as possible whilst keeping our back pretty straight and keeping our heels on the ground or the plate or whatever we're doing. And so this just suits me to a T. Now there's some people that are built for bar squatting, but I actually haven't met anyone that isn't really built for hack squatting. Like, it just can cook everyone. And just the fact that we are trying to work quads, like we're not interested, like if squatting is your sport, or you're a powerlifter, then of course you've got a bar squat. But if your goal is hypertrophy, I think I could make a pretty strong argument that the hack squat could almost be or is superior to doing a bar squat, just simply because the overall output, you can just keep flogging the quad, rep after rep. Stability doesn't matter. The back's not going to give out. You haven't got a ton of weight on your back necessarily. And also what we can do with bands, I've got some reverse bands set up, which I'll go through in another video, but essentially what they do is they make the resistance easier at the bottom where it's the hardest, and then they turn off as I come up. So I'll go through the maths behind it, but essentially allows us to move more weight overall, and obviously keeps us a little bit, the joints a bit safer in the position where we're most vulnerable. Now I found the secret to a 20 rep hack squat PB, which is red snakes. So I tend to vary the rep range in this. When I've got a spot, I'll tend to go heavy, somewhere between 6 and 10, but I wasn't really in the mood, so I chucked a weight on that I could probably squeeze out 8 or 10 reps normally, and committed myself to 20 reps by giving myself a red snake before I did it. I tend to respond better to being rewarded up front and then living with the guilt of not completing the required task. So this is going to be a pretty boring 3 or 4 minutes for those of you who are not interested in intensity, but this is how your top set of squats should look, in my opinion. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm the lord of intensity. There's guys out there that will put me to shame, but I think that most of you watching this video would benefit from trying to get yourself to a level of intensity that replicates this. What I think of intensity, or how I define it, is essentially moving as much weight as possible with good form. So the good form on this is going to mean heels pinned to the plate always, and my lower back or sacrum, sort of bottom of my spine, top of the hip pinned to the bench padding at all times, and you simply just hang in there. So literally every rep felt like a 1 rep max. So I'm having sort of big breathers in between, and I'm going to run out of shit to say. while you sit through this, but I suffered through it for 4 minutes, so can you. But really, this is where the results come from for your quads, is movements where we can move lots of weight, where we can keep the weight applied to the quads, which means we're not worried about what our back's doing, we're not falling onto our toes, we're not inverting the knees, all that kind of stuff. We're just simply lengthening the quad, which means bending the knee with as much load as possible. And that's all there really is to it. So a lot of people sort of get confused about what kind of squat is the best squat to do. The best squat to do is the one that allows you to lengthen the quad with as much weight as possible, and obviously you can do injury free. And that's all there really is to it. So it kind of takes away some of the, I guess, the uncertainty around, what should I do? Should I do a front squat? Should I do a bar squat? Should I do a hack squat? Whatever you can squat the deepest. So I've just given away bar squats over the last probably 12 months or so, and my quads have never been bigger since I've been hack squatting. It's quite taxing on the central nervous system, but again, you can muck around with reverse bands or even bands that are coming from the bottom, which can apparently change the way your body recovers. So I think the reverse band is actually less taxing, my understanding is, on the central nervous system than having bands that come from the ground, which make the rep harder as you come up. But basically how these reverse bands work is, so say you can do, you can only squat what you can get up from the bottom. So say you can do 100 kilos for 10 reps on a hack squat with no bands. Say the band gives you 20 kilos of help. So let's say we put 120 on and the 20 kilos of help band. So you get 120 kilos on there. Now when you get to the bottom, you're still only doing 100 kilos like you were without the band. But when you get halfway back up, you're moving 120. So we've still got a little bit left in the tank at the top, and so it allows us to really push, or I guess load the quads through the sort of the area that we still have some left, for lack of a better term. So overall output again is increased by this. So that's sort of how the reverse bands work. And of course, again, there's a benefit of joints feel a little bit more stable because you're less compromised at the bottom. But I think this this is almost over. So yeah, I mean, that was pretty brutal. And you kind of want to have some intensity replicating that, in my opinion, whether it's 5 reps or 30. Just to finish off whatever was left in legs, we're going to enjoy doing a banded leg press. So these are the opposite to the bands we were doing before. So these are not assisted. So basically what this does is, with your normal leg press, presumably the hardest part of the movement will be when you're down the bottom or when you're just coming off the bottom. What this does is this keeps that about the same. So it's still hard at the bottom, but as you come up, it gets exponentially harder as the bands tighten. So it really makes the movement a more efficient movement in the sense that each rep is harder. And I use leg press really just to squeeze whatever is left out of my legs. When we talked about stability earlier, obviously your squat, even the hack squat, requires some level of technique and stability. Leg press, you just lock yourself in, you've got a hard bench to push you back into, everything's rock solid, and you can just absolutely just hammer the quads. It's not much hammering involved, there's a bit of glute involved when you throw these bands in, but it just absolutely cooks you, and it takes away your rest point as well. So you'll find that you'll want to rest if you're doing a high rep set somewhere near the top of the movement. Now you never want to obviously lock your knees, but resting with your knees slightly, slightly bent at the top is a pretty easy way to rest. Now that is taken away from you with banded leg press, because that is actually the hardest part of the movement when you're actually at the top. So I'm going for 100 repper here, and you'll find towards the end, like the last 50 are just going to be little pulses, and you'll be amazed how much that actually hurts. The first sort of 40 or 50 are a bit of a gift. I mean, they're not easy, but you sort of think, oh, she'll be right, because of the way that the profile of this movement changes by having the bands putting on and making it harder at the top. Once you get gassed, you really are gassed. Like you hit a wall and you're like, shit, like I'm in trouble here. And so the last 40, 50 reps are just a grind. So again, it'll be another couple of minutes of just watching me suffer in pain, but it really just makes the workout efficient. So we're after movements that are efficient. Efficient basically means movements that hit the muscle with as much load as possible, with as little need for stability, etc. So that's really what we're looking for. So leg press, obviously winner, chucking the bands on makes it even more of a viable option, particularly when you've had a pretty big or intense squat earlier on, where you really don't want to be sitting here and doing sort of 4 or 5 heavy sets. You'd rather just get in here and just get whatever's left out of the legs as possible. So as you can see, I'm resting. I'm not resting with my legs locked. Don't ever do that. That's how those gym fail videos start circulating. And you probably can just notice actually there my right foot's slightly higher than my left, so you don't want to have that. Sometimes you'll find your feet will slip up a little bit, but in a perfect world you will have your obviously feet at the same height. I like a nice wide stance. It makes it a little bit more hip and glute dominant, and just having my toes out wide and just allowing my knees to come out around my hips. Obviously I'm sort of taller than the average person that gets in there, so I'll need to have a wider stance, but I get most of the girls to do a wider stance for the reasons I mentioned, and also for the fact that they tend to have wider pelvises and hips, so they actually feel a little bit more stable in there. But that's really how you train legs, guys. There's not much else to it. It is just about intensity. It is about good form and efficient movements. So if you manage to sit through that, congratulations, smash legs, and please subscribe.